If you've ever looked at a map of Brazil, you've probably noticed something strange. Almost the entire population of this massive country is crowded along the coastline, while the vast interior remains eerily empty. At first glance, the answer seems obvious. The Amazon rainforest, a wild, untamed jungle filled with danger, disease, and dense vegetation. It feels like the perfect explanation. But what if that's completely wrong? What if the real reason has nothing to do with the Amazon at all, and instead lies hidden in plain sight? For centuries, something quietly trapped millions of people along Brazil's coast. A massive natural barrier, stretching for hundreds of miles, so powerful that it shaped the destiny of an entire nation. Most people have never even heard of it. This is the story of the Serra do Mar, a towering wall of rock and forest that turned Brazil's early history into a struggle against nature itself. A barrier that settlers couldn't cross, a prison they couldn't escape, and the consequences of that barrier are still visible today. So why is most of Brazil empty? Let's find out. If you enjoy uncovering hidden stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. And drop a comment below. What do you think is the real reason? Long before Europeans arrived, Brazil's southeastern coastline was already home to millions of people. Indigenous groups like the Tupi thrived on the coast, living off the ocean and practicing small-scale agriculture. They had no reason to scale the steep cliffs of the Serra do Mar. For them, the mountains and dense forests weren't obstacles. They were simply part of their world, boundaries that they had no need to cross. Life on the coast was sufficient. Then, in the year 1500, everything changed. Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral and his fleet stumbled upon Brazil while sailing to India. Initially, the Portuguese had little interest in conquering the interior. They were a seafaring people who thrived on maritime trade, and the narrow coastal strip seemed perfect for their needs. They established small settlements, traded with the indigenous peoples, and harvested pau-brasil, a tree that produced a valuable red dye and gave the country its name. For a while, this arrangement worked. But soon, the Portuguese crown began to feel the pressure of competition. Spain, their neighbor and rival, was building vast inland empires, conquering the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru, and hauling unimaginable amounts of gold and silver back to Europe. Portugal couldn't ignore this. They wanted their share of the riches, and that meant pushing inland to search for their own sources of wealth. This is where the problems began. When the Portuguese turned their gaze inland, they ran straight into the Serra do Mar, and it was unlike anything they had ever faced. Standing on the beach, they were confronted with a towering green wall of solid rock covered in one of the densest forests on Earth, the Atlantic forest. Unlike the Amazon, which sprawls out over flat terrain,
The Atlantic forest is a kind of rainforest.
the Atlantic forest clings to steep, jagged slopes, creating an environment so challenging that it seemed impossible to penetrate. The soil wasn't suitable for farming. The vegetation was so thick it was almost impenetrable, and the relentless rains turned the steep trails into muddy death traps. For the settlers, the Serra do Mar wasn't just a mountain range. It was an inescapable prison wall. With no easy way inland, the Portuguese were forced to adapt to life on the coast. In the northeast, where the coastal plains were wider, sugarcane plantations began to thrive. This brought wealth to the region and helped sustain the colony. But in the southeast, where the Serra do Mar loomed closest to the shore, life was much harder. Settlements like São Vicente and the port of Santos were cramped, isolated, and vulnerable to pirate attacks. The soil wasn't great for large-scale agriculture, and the narrow strip of land left little room for expansion. As the years went by, the settlers grew desperate. They needed a way off the beach, and the only way was up. This desperation gave rise to a group of frontiersmen who would play a pivotal role in Brazil's history, the Bandeirantes. These were tough, determined men of mixed Portuguese, indigenous, and African descent. They were driven by the promise of gold, silver, and slaves, and they were willing to do whatever it took to conquer the Serra do Mar. Using ancient indigenous footpaths like the Caminho do Pé Biru, they began their ascent. The journey was brutal. The trails were steep and narrow, the jungle was swarming with dangers, and the weather was unforgiving. But the bandeirantes were relentless. Slowly but surely, they clawed their way up the cliffs and into the interior. What they found on the other side changed everything. Beyond the Serra do Mar lay the Brazilian highlands, a vast plateau with cooler air, rolling hills, and sprawling river basins. It was a completely different world from the sweltering, claustrophobic coast. Here, there was room to expand, opportunities to farm, and most importantly, the promise of gold. In the late 1600s, the bandeirantes struck gold in a region that would become known as Minas Gerais. This discovery triggered a massive gold rush and transformed São Paulo, a small, impoverished settlement near the edge of the plateau, into a crucial hub for expeditions into the interior. But gold was only the beginning. By the 19th century, the gold reserves had dwindled, but the region found a new source of wealth: coffee. The cool climate and rich volcanic soil of the highlands made it one of the best places in the world to grow coffee. Plantations spread across the interior, and São Paulo became the center of this booming industry. There was just one problem: moving massive quantities of coffee beans down the Serra do Mar was almost impossible. The steep trails that had carried gold were no match for the sheer volume and weight of coffee. If Brazil wanted to dominate the global coffee trade, they needed a better solution. Enter the São Paulo Railway. In the 1860s, British engineers were hired to construct a railway that could conquer the Serra do Mar. It was a monumental task. The cliffs were too steep for traditional train tracks, so they built a system of steam-powered cables and pulleys to haul train cars up and down the mountain. The railway was an engineering marvel and a turning point in Brazil's history. It connected the fertile highlands to the port of Santos, allowing coffee to flow out to the world and wealth to flow back in. The railway also opened the door for millions of immigrants, primarily from Europe and Japan, who came to work in the coffee fields and later in the factories that sprang up in São Paulo. The city grew rapidly. Today, São Paulo is the largest city in the Americas, with over 20 million people in its metropolitan area. So, why is most of Brazil empty? It's not because of the Amazon rainforest, as many people believe. The real reason lies in the Serra do Mar, a towering wall of rock and jungle. This natural barrier forced the Portuguese to develop along the coast and shaped the country's population distribution for centuries. Today, Brazil's geography still influences its development. The coastal cities remain the heart of the country's population and economy, while the interior remains largely underpopulated. But the story of the Serra do Mar is a powerful reminder of how humans can overcome even the most daunting challenges. What other geographic barriers have shaped the course of history? And how might Brazil's story have unfolded if the Serra do Mar hadn't stood in the way? Let me know your thoughts, and thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What other mysteries should we explore next?